In the golden age of streaming, true crime content has found a permanent home in our living rooms and in our collective psyche. With just a click, audiences can consume real crime footage, detailed recreations, and even interviews with the perpetrators, all from the comfort of their couch. The genre is booming, and streaming giants like Netflix are leading the charge with increasingly high budget dramatized portrayals of serial killers and infamous crimes. From Mindhunter to Conversation with a Killer, Netflix has positioned itself as a hub for gripping and often disturbing content. With the success of its anthology series Monster, especially the polarizing but massively popular Dahmer, it was no surprise when Monster, the Ed Gein Story dropped, an 8-part dramatization of the infamous Plainfield Butcher, active between 1945 and 1957. Ed Gein became a twisted cultural icon, known for his grave robbing, necrophilia, and murders that inspired classic horror films like Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs. But despite its high production values, compelling visuals, and committed performances, Monster, the Ed Gein Story fails both ethically and narratively. It glamorizes a brutal killer, marginalizes his victims, and veers so far into irrelevant subplots that the core horror of Gein's crimes becomes diluted, if not outright dismissed. In its attempt to create prestige television, it compromises truth for shock and sympathy for spectacle. The ethical problem: glamorizing the monster. One of the most alarming issues with Monster, the Ed Gein Story, is its glamorization of Gein himself. Netflix did something similar with Dahmer, portraying the killer with an aesthetic, humanizing lens that some viewers found sympathetic. But with Ed Gein, the misstep feels even more egregious. Let's be clear, Ed Gein was not a misunderstood loner. He was a deeply disturbed individual who committed horrific acts: murder, body mutilation, grave desecration, and necrophilia. Yet the show attempts to present him as a tragic figure, a victim of bad parenting and societal neglect. His crimes are shown as if they were stemmed from psychological trauma and outside influence: his mother's religious fanaticism, his girlfriend's enabling, even his fascination with horror comics. The implication seems to be that Gein wasn't entirely responsible, as if he merely became a monster due to circumstance. This sort of moral relativism isn't new in true crime. We have seen similar framing in biopics like Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Wild, where Jack Efron plays Ted Bundy with a disarming charm that made audiences question whether they were watching a horror film or a twisted romance. But with Gein, the dissonance becomes even more unsettling. This is a man who wore human skin, created trophies from body parts, and mutilated corpses. And yet the show leans into emotional beats and soft focus character work that suggests that we should somehow understand him. In a particularly jarring moment, the series ends with an emotional scene in which Gein, now old and institutionalized, dies and sees a vision of his mother, who smiles and tells him she is proud. Accompanied by slow melancholic music, it plays like a redemptive send-off. Instead of confronting the lifelong horror he inflicted, we get a fictionalized spiritual closure, devoid of guilt or consequences. This kind of portrayal is not just misleading, it's dangerous. When media romanticizes serial killers, it risks softening the horror of their crimes and rebranding them as anti-heroes. Such narratives may inspire obsession or even mimicry in susceptible individuals. More broadly, they warp public perception, turning real tragedies into entertainment and perpetrators into twisted celebrities. There is already a disturbing trend of true crime fandom crossing into admiration. Serial killer fan art, thirst posts about murderers, even Halloween costumes. It's one thing to try to understand evil, it's another to aestheticize it. Netflix's portrayal of Ed Gein tiptoes too far into that territory. The psychological effect of these portrayals is rarely acknowledged. Research shows that frequent exposure to stylized depictions of violence can desensitize audiences and blur moral lines. When serial killers are given emotional backstories and redemptive arcs, it creates a false equivalency between their pain and the irreversible trauma they caused. Narrative drift, a story that forgets its subject. Despite its title, Monster the Ed Gein Story often feels like it has little interest in telling Ed Gein's story at all. The 8-episode structure is bloated and overstuffed. filled with tangents that have more to do with film history than with Gein's crimes. Instead of focusing on the psychological and social forces behind Gein's descent into madness, the show devotes significant time to exploring Alfred Hitchcock's process while making Psycho, including extended scenes about actor Anthony Perkins' personal life. Later, the narrative drifts towards Toby Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and even to The Silence of the Lambs. While these films were indeed inspired by Gein, the amount of screen time they occupy feels excessive, especially considering the title suggests the show is about the real man, not the fictional monsters he inspired. It's jarring and disorienting. Just when the show builds momentum around Gein's crimes or psychological state, it cuts to yet another Hollywood subplot. Do we really need an in-depth exploration of Anthony Perkins' sexuality in a show about Gein's dismemberment of women? These tangents pull viewers away from the subject at hand and dilute the tension that true crime storytelling thrives on. Even worse, the final episode introduces an almost comic book style team up with famous serial killers Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and others, implying that Gein was part of some imagined rogues gallery of horror. It plays like a grim version of the Avengers, and it completely undercuts any serious reflection on the gravity of Gein's actions. It's not edgy storytelling, it's tonal whiplash that borders on parody. What's most frustrating is how much of this time could have been used to explore Gein's mental illness, the failure of rural institutions to intervene, or the way misogyny shaped his crimes. But instead, the show indulges in horror movie trivia, delivering behind-the-scenes drama when it promised a psychological deep dive. A strong narrative would have grounded Gein in a real-world context, how his social isolation, repressed sexuality, religious indoctrination, and untreated mental illness combined into a perfect storm. But these angles are sidelined, and the result is a fragmented portrait with more style than substance. The missing piece, the victims. Perhaps the most glaring omission in Monster, the Ed Gein Story, is the near total absence of the victim stories. Just like in Dahmer, the victims are barely introduced, let alone humanized. We don't learn about their lives, their dreams, or the impact their deaths had on their families and communities. They are footnotes in their own tragedy. This is not a minor oversight. In true crime, the victim should be the emotional center of the story. Their lives mattered. Their stories deserve to be told. Instead, we are given 8 hours of television where the killer is the focal point and the people he destroyed are treated as background noise. Ed Gein's known victims, Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden, barely register in the narrative. Warden, a local hardware store owner whose disappearance finally led to Gein's arrest, is given perhaps a few minutes of screen time. We never get a sense of who she was outside of the moment of her abduction. Was she a mother, a sister, a community member? The show doesn't say. This erasure is a part of a larger issue in the true crime media, the commodification of trauma. Victims become tools to progress the killer's story arc, not people whose life deserves honoring. It's a disturbing pattern and one that Monster does little to correct. This show also misses the opportunity to explore how these crimes impact small communities long term. Gein's crimes devastated the rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, creating a legacy of fear and shame that lasted generations. Instead of exploring the collective trauma, the series fixates on Gein's internal suffering, a baffling choice given the real-world devastation he left behind. True crime's dilemma: entertainment versus responsibility. There's an ongoing debate in the true crime community. Where does storytelling end and exploitation begin? On one hand, audiences are drawn to true crime to understand the darker corners of the human psyche. Some want to protect themselves by learning about real threats, others are simply fascinated by the extremities of human behavior. But entertainment doesn't exist in a vacuum, especially in stories involving real suffering and trauma. Creators have a moral responsibility to avoid sensationalism, and Monster, the Ed Gein Story, too often crosses that line. True crime, when handled with care, can be a force for good. Documentaries like The Staircase, The Jinx, or When They See Us show how media can highlight injustice, examine systematic failure, and even lead to real-world change. But when the focus becomes glamorizing the killer or building a dark cinematic universe, we risk desensitizing viewers to violence and distorting real history. Netflix had the resource to do something different, to produce a thoughtful, investigative, victim centered narrative. Instead, it chose to walk the path of shock, stylization, and moral ambiguity. And we, the audience, must also reflect on our role in this. Why do we binge watch these shows? Are we watching to understand or just to feel a thrill? Do we remember the names of the victims or only the killers? If true crime becomes another form of horror entertainment without ethical boundaries or emotional accountability, then we risk turning real human suffering into spectacle and nothing more. Conclusion: reclaiming the narrative. Monster, the Ed Gein story may look like prestige television, but it ultimately fails both as a narrative and as a piece of cultural commentary. By glorifying its subject, losing focus through unnecessary subplots, and ignoring the victims, it becomes another example of true crime gone wrong. We need to demand better. True crime, when done right, can be a powerful lens for examining justice, morality, and human psychology. But when it veers into glorification and spectacle, it does more harm than good. Netflix had the platform to set a new standard, to create a cautionary tale, a cultural reckoning, or a nuanced portrait of evil. Instead, it created a series that asks us to pity the monster and forget those he destroyed. And if we keep telling stories that center the killer, sympathize with him, and erase his victim, what does that say about us? When entertainment begins to worship the monster who stands up for the people he destroyed.
I know you told your friends